Episode 345, Insurance, or if you're from the Deep South, Insurance. This is the Change Underground. I'm your host, John. Decarbonise the air, recarbonise the soil. An anecdote to start the episode. A colleague at work asked to have a chat. Their story is instructive of what's coming. They'd received a letter from their home insurer, provider of 16 years, informing them that at the end of the current policy period they would no longer be able to offer insurance for the property. The reason being, the property is a few metres above sea level and 100 odd metres from the coast and will become an unacceptable flooding risk in the next 3 years. My colleague was understandably distraught. He'd had the same insurer for, as I said, 16 years. They'd made $25,000 in current values from my colleague without being subjected to a claim. He was going to check with other insurers to see if he had options and with the local council to see if his area had been rezoned for flooding. The thing is, without insurance, he'd be in breach of his mortgage agreement, which requires the property to be covered. If the property is uninsurable, he will be forced to sell, but only to someone prepared to live without insurance and not requiring a mortgage. That's to say, the pool of available buyers will be very small, and the value of his home will collapse to functionally zero. And I suspect this story will be repeated around this country and many others too. The reason for the change in flood risk is the rather obvious one to listeners of this podcast: climate change. In much the same way the marine species mentioned in the last episode are heading away from the tropical, subtropical north of the mainland and finding themselves off the waters of Tasmania, so too the warming waters are continuing to expand, heat having that effect. Add in the melting of glaciers, think Greenland and Antarctica, and the situation becomes more serious than an inability to negotiate insurance cover. This should be seen as a canary in the mine for the real-world effects of climate change. This has been one of many such canaries to have dropped off the perch over the last decade or so. To someone like my colleague, who is not a political animal nor particularly engaged in the latest science, this has come as a real shock. It's been a while since I looked, but 98 metres above sea level was considered the minimum altitude to be safe from both rising sea levels and, perhaps more importantly, tidal surges on top of the rising seas. This number, let's call it 100 metres for the sake of simplicity, means quite a large number of humans and their supporting ecosystems are at risk of inundation. This is something that's been exercising the minds of low-lying Pacific nations for at least 3 decades. They are feeling the effects already. Food gardens salted from seawater during tidal surges, rising water tables, ancient and still in use cemeteries throwing up body parts as the water levels rise beneath them. In Bangladesh, 45% of the population lives under 10 metres above sea level, and Bangladesh sits at the head of the shallow, in oceanic terms, Bay of Bengal, which is subject to cyclones and their associated storm surges. Now, most of European history prior to the modern period, say, 1600, was disrupted by the incursion into settled areas of excess population spilling out of the steppe. The Helvetia attempting to cross into Cisalpine Gaul and then off into Transalpine Gaul to avoid nomadic raiders is but one example. It gave Caesar his excuse to attack Transalpine Gaul, roughly modern France, and eventually to recross the Rubicon and trigger the civil war that ended the Roman Republic. Population movements have consequence. Attila the Hun, the Mongols, the Hungarians and so on represented a constant threat to the civilizations of settled peoples, both east and west. Ask the Chinese about the Mongols. Climate change is already driving people into movement. Many of us in Tasmania, who have moved from the mainland, have done so to avoid heat waves, fires and floods. If the heat waves of the current northern summer become a feature, not a bug of European life, then the Saharification of Mediterranean Europe is not outside the scope of possibilities. Then we'll see some migration of climate change refugees. Add in the effects upon Africa, Asia and South America, and we have the makings of a truly momentous reordering of human societies and nations. This is unlikely to be a peaceful process given the history of humanity. Listening to the Briefing Room podcast from the BBC this week, Can We Meet the Net Zero Challenge, link in the show notes, the future looks problematic to say the least. If every country met their stated aims around greenhouse gas reductions by 2050, then the temperature would still rise by 1.8 degrees above pre-industrial levels. If only those countries that have legislated for to meet this reduction, we're looking at 2.8 degree rise in global temperatures. And clearly this is not ideal under either scenario. Even those usually sober experts are starting to make noises re geoengineering. As I mentioned the term in the last episode as well as this, I should probably delve a bit deeper. So rather than removing the excess CO2, and to be fair, some ideas are designed for that, but the majority aren't, so rather than remove the excess CO2, geoengineering approaches the problem from a reduce the amount of heat entering the system approach. From the idea of giant sunshades in space, which could be disabled quickly if some unintended consequences of these occur, to the more difficult to reverse adding sulfur to the atmosphere approach, we have options that are less than optimal. There was an idea, still discussed, of adding iron filings to the ocean, so-called iron fertilization. From the Wikipedia page, iron fertilization. Quote, iron fertilization is the intentional introduction of iron to iron-poor areas of ocean surface to stimulate phytoplankton production. This is intended to enhance biological productivity and or accelerate carbon dioxide sequestration from the atmosphere, end quote. One possible downside is that of algal blooms and increasing toxicity in the areas and the regions where this is deployed. Difficult to reverse, I'd suggest. And I'm not sure we need to go down this route. The sunshades, though, might have some potential. Way back in the 1980s, I used to subscribe to Scientific American. Wonderful magazine, the arrival of which triggered a few days of reading in my spare time and being cut off from the rest of the world. Absolutely wonderful. Anyway, there was an article way back then suggesting geostationary PV panels in space sending power down to the surface using microwaves. The costs at the time were prohibitive, but maybe not now. And they could also double as sunscreens. The point is we have options. The more extreme are not on the table yet, but they might be in the next 5 to 10 years. In the meantime, we could go a long way to not needing these by shifting to a regenerative agricultural model. So let's decarbonise the air, recarbonise the soil. Thank you all for listening, and I'll be back, all things being equal, next week. This has been a JM Podcasting Services production. Link in the show notes.